Okay, good. Shkoyach. All right. Now let's say, but there's more. But there's more. All right. So let's say now we are up to Daf Nun, which is Emir Hashem tomorrow morning's Daf. Ha'itmar Allah. But one second, in this concept of Nachas Ruach Asisi Labaili, what about the following situation? Ha'itmar Allah Amra Baravuna Lo Nitzcha Ela Ba'osan Gimel Sados. This concept that a woman could say, let's say again, a husband, Ruvain, the husband, furnishes an actual document that says Rachel sold him a piece of land, and now suddenly we're saying that it's not going to work. Why is it not going to work? Because halacha l'maisa, she could always claim nachas ruach asisi lebaili. I was only going ahead and making my husband happy. The Gemara says, first of all, even if you say there can be a claim like that, that doesn't apply to all property. It only applies to 3 specific fields. Which 3 specific fields? So field number 1 is a field that they identified in the ksuva as the field that is to be the source of repayment for the ksuva, or source of payment for the ksuva. Top of nun, we'll say 50a. Va'achos sheyiche la b'ksuvasa, or another field which was identified but not named in the document itself. So case number 1 is a field that was actively identified in the ksuva as the source for ksuva payment. Case number 2 is a field that was designated but not actively identified in the ksuva itself. Va'achos shechnisa lo shum mishala. And another field that we'll say what we call nichsei tzon barzel. Nichsei tzon barzel is property that a woman brings into a property, that brings into marriage, that of course is hers. She retains title, but not only that, the value of the property itself is locked in. The value is locked in. So we'll say, so in these are the 3 cases where if a woman ends up selling these properties to her husband, she could claim it wasn't a true sale, but rather again, nachas ruach asisi labaili. All I was doing was trying to make my husband happy. The Gemara says, Lumi ute mai, what does this come to exclude? If you say it comes to exclude all other properties, kol shekein dahavila eva, then I will say all the more so that's going to create marital animosity. How so? The Amar La, because he's going to say to her, Einayich nasata begerishin b'misa. You're obviously setting your eyes on either my death or my divorce, right? Demise or divorce. That's why you aren't inquiring about other properties. Elalami ute nichse malug. Rather, it must be coming to exclude nichse malug. Must be coming to exclude nichse malug. So the Gemara says, one second. Ha'amar ameimar ish v'isha shemachro b'nichse malug lo asav lo klum. But Ameimar said that if a husband and wife sell nichse malug, now what that means is, I go to the husband and then I go to the wife, and I purchase the property independently from both of them. Lo asav lo klum. Ultimately, again, such a sale is irrelevant. Now, why is such a sale irrelevant? Why is that, Rabosai? Because the Gemara says, Ki itmar da ameimar. When is that true? Heicha dezabin ihu umis. That's true ultimately, again, when he sold it and he died. Asya ihi umafka, then she has the ability to extract the property, ultimately again, from sellers or from purchasers. Inami, zabna ihi umesa, or she sold it and died. Asehiu umafik betakanta derabanan. He has the ability to extract it from purchasers based on takana derabanan. What's the takana? Ba'usha hiskinu ha'isha shemachra b'nichse melog umesa baila umesa habal motzi miyad ala kuchos. So we'll say in Usha they made a takana. What was the takana? That a woman who sells off her nichse melog. So again, I will say what's interesting about nichse melog is, remember again, who owns, who has title to nichse melog? The woman. The woman has title to nichse melog. The husband has peiros. He gets usage. What happens if a woman sells her nichse melog? Is she allowed to do so? Absolutely. There's an interesting takana. What's the takana? That if a woman sells her nichse melog and then she dies, her husband has the ability to extract the nichse melog from the purchasers. Fascinating halacha. Aval heicha tezabninu tarvahu li alma. But if both of them consented to a sale to a third party, inami zabna I lididei, or if Rachel, the wife, sold it to the husband, zevine, then ultimately, again, it should work. It should work. So such a transaction actually should. So I'll say, so remember again, I just want to point out what's happening over here. All we're trying to figure out, all we're trying to figure out over here is the Mishnah's case, right? Because the Mishnah is telling us that halacha l'maisa, husband can't establish chazaka in his wife's property. So all we're just trying to figure out is so what would be the case? In other words, what would be the case ultimately where we'd have an havamina where that should be able to occur? So the Gemara is just pointing out, so we went through the entire process of what happens with Peros, and now the Gemara is also simply suggesting that maybe there is a case where a husband can establish chazaka in his wife's property. After all, again, as we've just seen over here, if ultimately, again, a wife sells her property to her husband, it sounds like, at least according to this opinion over here, that it is a valid sale. Now again, what's the tension? The tension is that whenever a wife sells something to her husband, maybe she always has an out. And what's the out? Nachas ruach asisi lebaili. I was just trying to keep things calm at home, but never meant to ever engage in a real transaction. Viva saying the other possibility is Ameimar d'Amar Rabbi Lazar, that Ameimar holds like Rabbi Lazar. And I will say, what did Rabbi Lazar say? So we'll say, so now we're going to get into another topic over here, but we're going to circle back. Desanya, watch this. Hamocheres avda opasak imoshish mishenu shloshim. So watch this. I go, right, Ruvain sells an Eved Kanani. He sells an Eved Kanani to Shimon. Now what happens, we'll say, so this is like with a, I don't know what the technical term is, but like he sold it, but yet he gets to use it. He gets to use it like a rent back, right? So Ruvain sells his Eved to Shimon, but the sale is predicated on Ruvain being able to use the Eved for the next 30 days. Okay, now watch this. Now both say, one other piece over here. There's a halacha called Yom o Yomayim. The halacha is that if a person chas v'shalom kills his Eved Kanani, one is chayiv misa for that. That brings with it a death penalty. Now there's an interesting halacha that says like this. Let's say a person, the master injures his Eved Kanani, but the Eved doesn't die immediately. The Eved dies a day or two later. What's the halacha? The master is absolved from capital punishment. Now I want to point out this is dramatically different than when we injure Jew to Jew injury. Meaning, if Ruvain injures Shimon, right, and Shimon dies of his injuries, even if Shimon dies a year later from his injuries, Ruvain is chayiv in a capital fashion, right? Ruvain is chayiv for killing Shimon. Again, this is obviously assuming that you could attribute Shimon's ultimate demise to the injuries he suffered from Ruvain. But halacha l'maisa, again, it doesn't matter how much time elapses between the injurious event and the resulting death. If there's a clear connection between the event and death, then the perpetrator is chayiv. There's this specific, interesting halacha by Eved Kanani that says if the master kills the Eved Kanani right now, he's chayiv. But if the Eved himself survives for a day or two, then the master is absolved from capital punishment. Okay, so now watch this. This is fascinating. So the Gemara says, Hamocheres avdo pasak imoshishan shloshim yom. So Ruvain sells his Eved to Shimon, but part of the sale is that Ruvain is going to use it for the next 30 days. And what happens? During those 30 days, Ruvain injures the Eved. Ruvain injures the Eved. Rameir Omer, Harishon Yeshno Bedin Yoma Yomayim. So Rameir says, Ruvain, who is the former owner, now the one who's currently using it for 30 days, Ruvain is subject to the din of Yoma Yomayim. So in other words, if he injures the Eved, and the Eved doesn't die immediately, the Eved only dies a day or two later, Ruvain ultimately again will be pater. Because ultimately again the Eved is serving Ruvain. Eved is serving Ruvain. But the second guy, Shimon, is not subject to the halach of Yoma Yomayim. Why? Because the Eved is not serving him. What do you see from here? Kasavar, kinyan peros, ke kinyan aguftami. So we'll say, we've seen this concept many times before. That is usage tantamount to ownership. Is usage tantamount to ownership? So Meir holds that yes, usage is tantamount to ownership. Therefore, again, Ruvain, although Ruvain is not the titular owner, right? Ruvain doesn't have title because he sold the Eved to Shimon. But when Ruvain has usage during those 30 days, Ruvain becomes essentially the effective owner. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, the din of Yomo Yomayim, this injury of the Eved, Ruvain is subject to it, Shimon is not. Even though Shimon is the titular owner, because Shimon does not have usage, so in Rabbi Meir's worldview, usage equals ownership. Usage equals ownership. Okay. Rabbi Huda says, Hasheni yeshno medin Yomi Yomayim, mipnei shu kaspo. Rabbi Huda says, listen, really it is only Shimon who is the actual owner, who is subject to the law of Yoma Yomayim. But again, that's Shimon. Harishon einu b'din Yoma Yomayim she'eno kaspo. But the first one, Ruvain, who is the former owner, now current renter, is not subject to the halach of Yoma Yomayim. Why? Because the Eved is not his property. What does he hold? Kasavar, kinyan peros, lav kekinyan aguf. So both say a fundamental machlokes Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Huda. Rabbi Meir holds usage. You're going to see why this is what this has to do with anything that we're doing in just a moment. Right? Rabbi Meir holds that usage is the equivalent of ownership. Rabbi Yehuda holds that usage is not the equivalent of ownership. Kinyan aperos ke kinyan aguf, that's Rabbi Meir. Kinyan aperos lav ke kinyan aguf, that's Rabbi Yehuda. Comes along Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says, Omer, both say nun amud beis 50b. Rabbi Yossi Omer, shnehem yeshnan bedin yom yomayim. This is fascinating. Rabbi Yossi says, both Ruvain and Shimon are both subject to the halacha of yom or yomayim. Why? Zeh mipnei shu tachtov. Ruvain is subject to the law of Yoma Yomayim. Why? Because halacha l'maisa, he currently has usage of the Eved, and Shimon is subject to the law of Yoma Yomayim. Why? Because he is the owner of the Eved. Now we'll say, now in Rabbi Yossi's view, Rabbi Yossi, what's his issue? U'misapkale, I kinyan peres kinyan haguf dami, I lav kinyan haguf dami, the safek nefashos lahakel. So we'll say, so Rabbi Yossi is just not sure, right? Whereas Rabbi Meir is definitive that kinyan peros ke kinyan aguf, that usage is like ownership. Therefore, again, Ruvain, the user, is subject to Yomi Yomayim. Shimon, the titular owner, is not. And Rabbi Yehuda is certain that kinyan peros lav ke kinyan aguf. Therefore, Ruvain, the user, is not subject to Yomi Yomayim, but Shimon, the owner, is subject to Yomi Yomayim. Rabbi Yossi himself is not sure. He's not sure. Is usage equivalent to ownership or not? And therefore he's not sure. And therefore what does he say? Both Ruvain and Shimon are subject to the laws of Yom or Yomayim. I just want to point out, remember again, the laws of Yom or Yomayim, it's a kula. It's a kula, right? What it says is that halacha l'maisa, if the Eved doesn't die immediately, he survives a day or two, you are freed from any capital responsibility. That is dafka din in the right? Dafka din in the owner. So therefore, because Rabbi Yossi is not sure, is usage the equivalent of ownership? Therefore, halacha l'maisa, he says both Reuben and Shimon could avail themselves of Yom or Yomayim. Okay, well, so now here we come to it. Rabbi Elazar Omer. Rabbi Elazar says, Shnehem einon bedin Yom or Yomayim. No. Neither party ultimately again is subject to the laws of Yom or Yomayim. Why not? Zelafi she'eno tachtov, v'zelafi she'eno kaspo. So Shimon is not subject to Yom Yomayim. Why? Because he doesn't have possession. And Ruvain is not subject to Yom Yomayim. Why? Because he does not have ownership. So Rabbi said, what that sounds like according to Rabbi Elazar is, in order to be subject, for this specific instance, in order to be subject to Yom Yomayim, what do you need? Two things. Number one, ownership. Number two, usage. Usage, if you don't have both, then ultimately, again, you are not subject to Yom Yomayim. Now, ultimately, again, so what is this here? So we wanted to say that a Meimar holds like Rabbi Elazar. So what does that have to do with anything? So we'll say, so take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. So the Rashbam says over here, oh, actually, let's just finish. V'amar Rava, my time with Rabbi Elazar. What's Rabbi Elazar's logic? Where does he get this from? Amar Kra, lo yukam, ki kaspo hu. So the pasuk says, ultimately again, the master injures the Eved, and ultimately again, he remains alive for ach im yom o yomayim ya'amod. If he goes and he stays alive for another day or two after being injured, lo yukam ki kaspo hu. Literally again, he will not be avenged. Why? Ki kaspohu, for he is the possession of the owner. Now what does that teach me? The Gemara says, kaspohu, kaspo hamiyuchad lo. In Rabbi Elazar's view, there can only be one owner of the Eved. And that owner must satisfy two criteria. Number one, actual ownership title, and number two, usage. What does this have to do with our sugya? Take a look at the Rashbam. First short line, or last wide line in the Rashbam, then into the short lines. Kikaspohu, listen to this. Miyusahu, demana sinas tam hayitzarach litem bedavra velomra lo yukam lefisha kaspohu. Inami midematzi lemichtav kikasafu mishum hachi nami yolaf ameimar lagab. So I say, fine. So the point over here is kikas. That phrase kikaspo is an extraneous phrase. Now, what Rabbi Elazar uses it for is to teach me that the only way you're subject to the law of Yom Yomayim is if that Eved is your possession. And what is the definition of possession? Title and usage. Title and usage. So we'll say, what does that have to do with us? Now finish up the Rashbam. Watch this. This is great. So the Gemara. So now the Rashbam says, so Mishum hachi nami yalefa meimer lagabe nichse melug dechevan de'ena miyuchad lo leish v'lo leisha eno karoi sad haish v'lo sada isha. So we'll say, now watch this. Rabbi Elazar wants to say that this case over here of the Eved, right? So what happened? Reuven owned it. Reuven sold it to Shimon. But part of the sale was that Reuven gets it back for 30 days. So we'll say, in this scenario, according to Rabbi Elazar, who's the owner of the Eved? Who's the owner? Who's the owner? Neither of them are the owner, right? Because neither one of them has both title and usage. So therefore, the Gemara wants to suggest that Ameimar borrowed this model, and what did he apply it to? Nichsei Melug. What's Nichsei Melug? Nichsei Melug is property that a wife brings into marriage. Who owns the property? Who owns it? Wife. Who gets usage of it? Husband. So what's the status of something where one person holds title and one other person has usage? Who is the owner? Who is the owner? It's not clear. I mean, it is clear. It's both of them and none of them. So both say, therefore, what? Now watch this. Finish up the Rashbam. Therefore, the isha, since this field doesn't exclusively belong to the wife or to the husband, it's not called the field that belongs to the husband, nor is it called the field that belongs to the wife. Therefore, therefore, both say, even if halacha l'maisa, you have a case where both of them sold the field, that sale is still going to be invalid. Why is it going to be invalid? Because both parties are selling something that doesn't fully belong to them. So just as in the case of the Eved, neither Reuven nor Shimon owns the field, and therefore again in this limited conversation over here, neither will be subject to the laws of Yom or Yomayim. Ameimar wants to suggest this is the same issue with going ahead and purchasing or selling Nichsei Melug. Who is the owner of the Nichsei Melug? Well, the wife has title, the husband has usage. So therefore, again, Ameimar wants to suggest any sale of Nichsei Melug is almost always going to be invalid. It's always going, because there is no singular owner of that field. So both say, so now let's just loop this back. We're not finished, but let's loop this back. Remember, what are we trying to figure out over here? We're trying to figure out, the Mishnah makes a statement. What was the Mishnah statement? A husband cannot make a chazaka in his wife's field. So again, what did the Gemara say to that? Pshita. That's obvious. Of course he can. What is he going to claim? I've been eating peiros for 3 years uncontested in my wife's field. Shkoyach, you're entitled to that. You're entitled to that. That doesn't give you chazaka. So we'll say, this now leads into an entire conversation essentially about the ability of a wife to sell her husband property, or for a husband and wife to sell property to a third party. So we don't have clarity yet exactly how these things work, but here are the competing issues. Competing issue number one is, although a wife says that she's selling property, and even if they have a shtar to that effect, the concern is she could always claim what? What could she claim? What could she claim? Nachas ruach asisi lebaili. I did not really mean to sell the field. I just wanted to make my husband happy. Okay, which would, of course, it kind of falls. We wouldn't call that coercion, but it falls into the coercion family. Coercion family. The other the other potential issue is that Ameimar just brought up is that maybe sale of Nichsei Melug property in general is problematic because there's no clearly defined owner. One party has usage, that's the husband. The other party has title, that's the wife. And maybe in that type of transaction, you can never really affect a comprehensive real estate transaction. Okay, so let's continue. We're not finished with this yet. And then along the way, we happen to just well say, always part of the beauty of what we do Daf Yomi is the opportunity, Baruch Hashem, like to pick up little additional nuggets along the way. So now we see this halach of Yoma Yomayim and this fundamental machlokes, who's considered to be the owner in Yoma Yomayim in this interesting case of a sale with a rent back. Okay, let's go weiter. Two dots, 50b. V'lo leish chazaka b'nichsei ishto. So we'll say, so ultimately again, so remember again, this is the same quotation as the Mishnah before, that a husband cannot create chazaka in his wife's property. Says the Gemara, V'hamarav, Eishes ish tzricha limchos. Rav said the following idea. Rav said that a married woman has to make a macha, has to object. Now what does that mean? Take a look at the Rashbam, almost straight across. Eishes ish, the Rashbam says, Shemachzik achar b'nichsei melug shala tzricha limchos mishum da'hu achar yesh lo chazaka im lo michsei v'sidas. We'll say, now watch this. Rachel's married to Reuven. Rachel has nichsei melug property. Shimon comes along and Shimon starts using her nichsei melug. So what's the halacha? So Rav said that Rachel has to lodge a macha. Everyone will say, what's a macha? An objection. What's the objection? What are you doing in my field? Why are you using my field? So if a woman sees someone using her nichsei milug, in order to prevent that person from making a chazaka, she has to lodge a macha. So the Gemara says, biman, who's using her field? Who's using her field? Ilema ba'acher, if it's just some guy, just call him Shimon, right? Some random guy. V'hamarav ein machzikim b'nichsei eshes ish. This is fascinating. Rav said, you cannot go ahead and you cannot go to make a chazaka in a married woman's property. Now, this is fascinating. Why can't someone else come along and make a chazaka in a married woman's property? Why not? So the Rashbam says over here, really interesting, right across. Dematzia amra al baili samachti shuyimcha v'arer v'lakach shatakti ubishar b'nei adam d'lo ba'al Rosa, listen to this. Why can't you make a chazaka in a married woman's property? Let's play this out. Rachel's married to Reuven. She has nichsei milug. Shimon comes using the property for 3 years uncontested. Shimon says, I have chazaka. What's the proof? The proof is that Rachel never lodged a macha. What's Rachel's defense? What's her defense? Thought my husband was going to make the macha, right? In other words, she's relying on her husband to make the macha. So therefore, her silence in no way is demonstrative of acquiescence to Shimon's ownership of the property. So we can't be talking about someone else because in general, there's an inability of someone else to make a chazak on a married woman's property. Elalav bibal. This is saying, rather, what must it be talking about? It must be talking about the husband. So what it must be saying is like this. What Rav is saying is as follows. It must be saying that Rav is saying that a married woman, if she sees her husband utilizing her property in a way that demonstrates ownership, if she wants to prevent him from making a chazaka, then what? She has to make a macha. What does that show you? That a husband can make a chazaka in his wife's property. I will say that contradicts the Mishnah. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Elalab bebal, Amar Rava. The Olam Bar Rava says, you're right. We're talking about the husband. So what's the case over here? Okay, gon, shechafar ba boros sichin uma'aros. What's the case, Rabbi Osai? Where you're right. Reuven's married to Rachel, and what does he do? He goes into her nichsei milug, and he begins digging pits, or caves, or cisterns. So we'll say, what is that? What is that? So look at the Rashbam, last of the short lines, the Olam Babal, Shechzik b'nechsei ishto ka'amarav, d'tzvicha limchos, sheyesh chazaka labal, v'afilu hachi lo tikshi de masnisin da'ha chazaka to ka'amarav, kigon shechafer ba'al boros, sichin u'ma'oros. Dileperos hu de'ishta b'lei nechsei milog de'ishto, v'lo lekilkol ha'karka lechafiras boros, kigon sadishin asui leboros, just going to refresh it, v'ilchach yesh chazaka. So we'll say, what's the case? Here we go. Reuven goes on to Rachel's field. Reuven's married to Rachel. They were happily married until tonight, right? And then what happens? She has nichsei milug. So what does he have in her nichsei milug? What does he have? Peros. Excellent. Good. So what does he do? So generally, going to say, if you were to consume peros for 3 years, can he claim chazaka? No. Why? That's his right. So what's the case over here? The case over here is where he goes onto that field and he starts digging wells. Does he have a right to dig wells? No. It's not his right. He has his, okay. So now he's doing something that he doesn't have a right to do, and he's doing that for a protracted amount of time, and it's uncontested. That's called chazaka. So in other words, what the Gemara is suggesting is like this. So when Rav comes along and says that a married woman has to make a macha if her husband is using her property, if he's using it in a way that represents his own legal right, peros, no macha is necessary, because again, there's no ownership that's being established. What's the case? Instead of using peros, he starts digging wells or holes or caves, whatever he's digging. He doesn't have a right to do that. And if he does that, and it's uncontested, that establishes chazaka. The Gemara says, but one second. We've already established back in Chezkas Abatim, that's what? The one thing that you don't do is you don't establish chazaka through destructive activity. Right? Why not? Take a look at the Rashbam. Again, it's in the wide lines, about 6 lines. In chazaka l'nizakin, kolomar heicha demachzik lechavero en yochol liton lekuchi biyadi shahari echzakti ba gimel shanim lechafiras boros sichnum aros dechi haygavdo lohavye chazaka dematzi toin idach mishum do achazka kitem achazki inshilo chashachus. Watch this. You cannot claim chazaka with a destructive act. Why? Because we'll say chazaka is only established when using the field in a normal fashion. But when you use, which makes sense because chazaka is supposed to be demonstrative of ownership. The assumption is that people take care of their property, people take care of their assets. Therefore, if you go ahead and you use the property in a destructive way, you don't create chazaka. So now we're getting a little bit circular over here. So let's just get with what we know. Mishnah says a husband can't establish chazaka on his wife's property. Rav says that if a woman sees a man making a chazaka on her nichsei milog, she has to make a macha. Who's the man? Who's the man? It can't be some random guy, because a random guy can't make a chazaka on a married woman's property. Why not? Because her lack of macha is not demonstrative of ownership, because she can say, I rely on my husband. So who's the guy? Who's the guy? The guy's her husband. Well, how is a husband making a chazaka on his wife's property? Oh, he's doing something destructive. Well, I should say he's digging pits. He's digging pits, right? Because that's not, in other words, his entitlement is peros. He's doing something that is outside of the scope of his entitlement, and therefore Allah Chalamai said that is demonstrative of ownership. But one second, we just said in Cheskas Habatim that you can't create chazaka through a destructive act. So how is he able to establish chazaka over here? Well, so here we go. Ein din chazaka l'nizakin. Oh, watch this. The Gemara says, no. So you have to pay attention and share. The Gemara says, what does it mean, ein chazaka l'nizakin? Ein din chazaka l'nizakin. Now, we'll say, in order to establish chazaka, how long do you normally need? 3 years. If you're doing something dramatic, and you're doing that dramatic thing in the presence of the owner, and the owner does not object, you can establish chazaka instantaneously. So when we say that a destructive act does not establish chazaka, that's not what it means. It means a destructive act is not subject to the regular laws of chazaka. The regular laws of chazaka require me to assert ownership over the course of 3 years. But if I'm doing something destructive, that's dramatic. If I do that in the presence of the current owner or the previous owner of the field, that establishes chazaka when? How long does it take? Immediately. Take a look at the Rashbam for just a moment. Ema ein din chazaka letztarech gimel shalom lenizakin hecha dechaskaso ayedei nezikin elali alter havye chazaka. So I'll say if you do something destructive in a field that establishes chazaka and there's no macha, that establishes chazaka immediately. The ein adam roa, literally again he changes it over here in the Hagos Tziyunim. The ein adam roa shemazikin karka shalo v'shosek. Because Rabbi say a person would never allow something destructive to occur to his property and not say something. Ella mochem yad v'hecha delo mocha hefsid v'hilchas. So therefore, if we pull this all together, listen to this. V'hilchach eishes ishtekam rav tzricha limchos miyad hu tzricha limchos me'achar shechover ba'baro sirin she'ein adam ra. Suppose I watch this. So here now we've interpreted the case. What's the case of where a woman is obligated to make a macha if her husband is using her property in order to prevent her from becoming the owner when he's doing something destructive? If he's just eating peros, you don't need a machal because that's his right. But if he does something destructive, normally again, when you do something destructive in the presence of the previous owner says nothing, that is demonstrative of your newfound ownership. So therefore, if Reuben goes over to Rachel's nichsei milug and he starts digging pits, and Rachel says nothing, that is demonstrative of the husband's ownership. And if Rachel wants to prevent her husband from making a chazaka on this field through a destructive act, what does she have to do? What does she need? Macha. She needs to object. Ibai said another possibility is Lav itmar Allah. The other possibility is when do we say that a destructive act does not establish chazaka? That's, for example, b'kutra. Literally, again, you set up a kiln that starts producing smoke. Rav Zavid Amar Beis Hakisei. Or for that matter, again, you set up a bathroom. Those type of destructive acts will not establish chazaka. But perhaps, again, a destructive act which is actively involved, in the actual usage of the land itself, that will go ahead and establish chazaka. Rav Yosef says, no. Both said last piece. Lastly, we're almost there. I need 4 minutes, and we'll be there. Rav Yosef Amar, the olam ba'achar. Rav Yosef says, no, scratch that. When Rav said before that if a married woman wants to prevent a man from making a chazaka or a nichsei milug, it's not her husband. It's a regular guy. But one second, we just said a regular guy can't make a chazaka in a married woman's property. Why not? Because her silence is not demonstrative of acquiescence. Why? Because why was she silent? She was assuming who was going to take care of it? Her husband. So what's going on over here? So the Gemara says, Rav Yossi Amar the Olam Ba'achar. Could go Sha'achla. This is very interesting. Sha'achla miktzas chazaka b'chay habal v'shalosh li'achar misas habal. This is very interesting. I will say the case over is as follows. So Rachel is married to Reuven, and what happens? Shimon comes along, and while Reuven is alive, Shimon goes ahead and uses the property uncontested. After Reuven dies, husband dies. Shimon uses the field for another 3 years under Rachel's watch, and Rachel never says anything. So in a case like this, if Rachel never made a macha about Shimon's use, Shimon could establish a chazaka. Why? This is great. I mean, not for Rachel, but it's interesting. Migo di boy amarle, big amarla, because he could have said to her, Ana zavinta minach. So remember again, when could a married woman claim that her silence is not acquiescence? When her husband is alive. If her husband is alive, then she could claim, I was relying on my husband to go ahead and make the macha. Oh, he didn't, I didn't know, I thought he did it. He didn't do it? Okay, I'm sorry, but I don't agree, you're not the owner. So that works well. She could claim that when her husband's alive. When her husband is no longer alive, the obligation of macha falls upon her. So watch this case. Rachel is married to Reuven. Shimon uses that property for a year while Reuven is alive. Then Reuven dies. After Reuven dies, Shimon uses the field uncontested for another 3 years. The Gemara says in that case, Rachel's failure to make a macha allows Shimon to assert chazaka. Why? Because Shimon has a migo. What's his migo? His migo is, I could have just said, I used the field for 3 years once you became a widow. In other words, it's an easy case. His migo is, we can even forget about Reuven. I used this field uncontested for 3 years when you were no longer married, when you were widowed, and you never contested it. So he says, Migo di'i by amrla ana zavinta minach. I could claim, right, Shimon could claim, Rachel, I bought it from you after your husband died. Ki amrle nami at zavinta le. But when he makes the claim to say that Rachel, you sold it to Reuven and I bought it from Reuven, ultimately again Shimon is believed. So we'll say this is just a classic case of migo. So if Shimon's coming along and claiming, so we'll say the case in question would then be that halacha l'maisa. Rachel has a field, and let's just bring it all together. So Rav is saying like this. Rav is saying that Rachel has an obligation to make a macha about her property in order to prevent someone else from making a chazaka. We're just trying to figure out what that case is. So we know what the case is not. The case is certainly not going to be a case of her husband using peiros, because there's an obligation of macha, because that is considered to be normative usage. So we have two different possible interpretations of the case. Possibility one is that it's talking about her husband. So what would be a case where Rachel would be obligated to make a macha against her husband's usage of her nichsei mulug? What would be the case? What would be the case? Of where he's doing something destructive. Because the performance of a destructive act in the presence of the former owner is in and of itself an assertion of ownership. Right? Because otherwise, if I was the owner, I wouldn't let someone be destroying my field. If the person is doing a destructive act, that's clearly demonstrative that they're the owner and I am not. So that would be a case where if Rachel was the owner and Reuven was doing something destructive, even though it's her husband, she should be obligated to make a macha in order to prevent him from asserting chazaka. Or the other possibility is no. We're talking about a case where the person, the man, asserting chazaka over her property is another guy. And what's the case about saying? The case, interestingly enough, is where he claims, Rachel, I bought this field from your husband. Now what's the background to the case? The background to the case is that Shimon used the field for 1 year when Reuven was alive. He used it for another 3 years after Reuven died, and it was under the watch of Rachel, and now he's claiming that he bought it from Reuven. So Shimon is believed in that case. Why is Shimon believed in that case? Because he can make a migo. What's his migo? He could have totally left Reuven out of this, and what could he have claimed? He could have just simply claimed that he bought this from Rachel. Because after all, again, her husband's dead, so she can no longer claim that I was relying on someone else to make the macha. He used it for 3 years uncontested, could have made the claim that Rachel, I bought it from you. The fact that he makes a different claim that says, I bought it from Reuven, that's why I used it for a year under Reuven, now 3 years under you, that migo allows him to be believed. So therefore, again, this justifies Rav's statement that even though normally we say a married woman doesn't have to make a macha when it comes to her own property because she can rely on her husband, there are exceptions to that. And one exception case would be in the case of the husband himself when he does something destructive. Other exception case would be a case of where someone begins to use the property during the lifetime of the husband, but continues to do that even after the husband died. So I will say, what we're still left with over here, is at the end of the day, the Mishnah tells me a rule. And the rule that the Mishnah tells me is that a husband cannot make a chazaka in his wife's property, just like we'll see a wife can't make a chazaka in her husband's property. What we still have to iron out, right? The piece that we still have to iron out is halacha l'maisa. So what is the status of what we'll call spousal sales? That didn't sound right. What's the status? What's the status of property sales between spouses? How does that work? How does that work? Is it truly possible for a wife to sell her husband property? And again, we'll talk about the reverse as well. And the corollary to that is, what's the status ultimately when husband and wife together share or sell their respective rights to a third party? Does such a sale work or not? Again, those two things are still outliers. Ibn Hashem to be resolved in our next Shavosai. Shkoyach. All right, so mind this, there's no shir tomorrow morning. I don't know, what day is it today? It's Tuesday. Right? You want to daven? Anyone want to daven now? You can daven now, right? So again, just a reminder, our next shir is Thursday.